"We didn't order for your son," my sister Emily said, sliding the bread basket across the white tablecloth toward David, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, and I felt something crack inside my chest as I watched my 8-year-old boy look down at the woven basket filled with rolls, while his cousins, Emily's children, were already placing their orders with the server at Marcello's, the upscale Italian restaurant in downtown Portland, where my family had gathered for what my mother called a nice dinner together. David's small fingers reached for a roll, and I saw him glance at his cousins, 10-year-old Sophie and 12-year-old James, who were ordering the braised short ribs and the pan-seared salmon respectively, entrees that cost $38 and $42 according to the menu I'd studied carefully before we arrived, calculating in my head whether I could afford to cover David's meal and my own if things went the way they usually did. "The kids are so excited about the lobster ravioli," Emily continued, not looking at me, addressing our mother who sat at the head of the table in the private dining room Emily had reserved, and I realized with a sinking clarity that this had been planned, that my sister had specifically told the server that only her children would be ordering from the full menu, that David was already relegated to free bread and water before we'd even sat down. I opened my mouth to say something, to insist that my son deserved the same treatment as his cousins. But my father was already launching into a story about James's recent achievement at his private school, and my mother was nodding with that particular expression of pride she reserved exclusively for Emily's family. And the moment passed like so many moments before it had passed, with me silent and David learning once again that he mattered less. This wasn't the first time, I thought, watching David butter his roll with careful attention. His dark eyes lowered so no one would see the hurt I knew was there, because I'd seen it before. At the last family gathering when Emily had taken her kids to the aquarium without mentioning it to David, and the time before that when Christmas presents were opened and David received a $15 gift card while his cousins unwrapped iPads and designer clothes. The server returned with drinks, sparkling water for Emily's children, and I noticed David didn't even have a glass yet. Noticed, but felt paralyzed by the familiar weight of being invisible in my own family. The weight I'd carried for so long, I'd almost forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight. I'd been the disappointing daughter for as long as I could remember, long before David was born, long before I became a single mother at 23 and cemented my status as the family failure in a way that felt permanent and defining. Emily had always been the golden child, the one who did everything right, the one my parents spoke about with pride in their voices at neighborhood gatherings and holiday parties, while I was the afterthought, the "oh, and Rachel is doing something" addendum to conversations about their children. When we were teenagers, I discovered by accident that my parents had established a college fund for Emily, but not for me. Found out when I was 17 and asked my father about financial aid forms, and he'd looked uncomfortable and said we'd figure something out, while Emily already had $40,000 waiting for her freshman year at Oregon State University. I'd worked 30 hours a week at a coffee shop while attending Portland Community College, taking classes part-time because that was all I could afford, and I remembered sitting in my 10-year-old Honda Civic in the parking lot between my shift and my evening graphic design class, eating vending machine crackers for dinner, while Emily posted photos on social media from her dorm room, her sorority events, her spring break trips that our parents funded. My mother had explained it once, when I'd finally asked directly why Emily got financial support, and I didn't. And she'd said something about Emily having more potential and needing to establish herself properly, and the words had landed like stones in my stomach, because what she meant was that I wasn't worth the investment, that they'd looked at both their daughters and decided one deserved their resources and the other would have to make do with whatever she could scrape together herself. I'd chosen graphic design because I loved it, because I'd always been good at art and visual communication. But my parents had made it clear they saw it as impractical, not a real career like Emily's business degree. And when I'd gotten pregnant at 23 with David, when his father Marcus had left 6 months into the pregnancy because he wasn't ready for this responsibility, I'd watched my parents' disappointment calcify into something harder, something that felt like resignation, as if I'd finally proven what they'd suspected all along. Emily had gotten married at 25 in a wedding that cost $30,000, which our parents paid for, and I'd been 5 months pregnant, standing in a bridesmaid dress that had to be altered twice, watching my sister become the version of success our family recognized, while I represented every choice they'd warned us against making. The pattern had been set so early, I realize now, watching David nibble his bread at this expensive restaurant. The golden child and the disappointment, the one who deserved and the one who had to earn scraps. And I'd been living in that pattern for so long I'd almost forgotten it wasn't natural, wasn't inevitable, wasn't something I had to accept forever. The dinner continued around me like I wasn't there, like I'd learned to expect over the years, with my mother asking Sophie about her piano recital and my father listening intently to James describe his science fair project while David sat beside me eating his second bread roll and pretending not to notice that no one had asked him a single question. "Rachel's still doing that freelance work, aren't you?" my mother said finally, glancing at me with that expression I'd come to recognize as obligation, as if she'd suddenly remembered I was present and needed to make a minimal effort at inclusion. And I noticed she didn't phrase it as a real question, didn't wait for my answer before turning back to Emily to ask about the new car she'd posted on social media. My father mentioned Marcus then, because he always did eventually. Said something about if David's father had stuck around, in the context of discussing James's involvement in youth soccer, and I felt the familiar shame wash over me, even though I knew intellectually that Marcus leaving wasn't my fault, that his abandonment of his son when David was 2 years old said everything about Marcus and nothing about our worth. "Some men just aren't cut out for responsibility," Emily said, and her tone was sympathetic, but her eyes held something else, something that looked like satisfaction, like my failed relationship confirmed her superiority in a way that mattered to her. The server brought out the entrees for Emily's children, beautiful plates of expensive food that Sophie and James barely looked at, already talking over each other about their next vacation to Hawaii, a trip my parents were funding as a educational experience, and I cut my own pasta into small bites, the cheapest thing on the menu at $18, while David asked quietly if he could have some of mine. "Rachel, have you thought about getting a real job?" my father asked. And there it was, the question he asked every few months, phrased slightly differently each time, but always carrying the same message, that my work as a freelance graphic designer wasn't legitimate employment, wasn't something he could explain to his golf buddies or mention at the Rotary Club. I'd tried explaining before, years ago, that I made a living wage, that I supported David and myself, that I'd built a client base and had steady work, but my father's definition of a real job involved an office and a boss and benefits. The traditional markers of employment that didn't account for the changing landscape of work or the fact that my freelance income, while modest, was entirely self-generated. Emily worked part-time as a consultant for her husband's real estate firm, a position that seemed to involve mostly attending lunches and posting on the company's social media, but that was considered respectable because it was connected to her husband's business, because it fit the narrative of the successful family my parents wanted to project. I stayed quiet through the rest of the meal, enduring for David's sake, because walking out would mean explaining to my son why we left, would mean acknowledging out loud that his grandmother and grandfather and aunt didn't value him the way they should. And I wasn't ready to break his heart that explicitly, even though I knew he already understood more than I wanted him to. What they didn't know, what none of them knew as they sat there dismissing my work and my life over expensive pasta and bread baskets, was that for the past 6 months I'd been working on something that consumed every evening after David went to sleep, something significant that I hadn't mentioned to anyone in my family because I'd learned years ago that sharing my professional hopes with them only gave them ammunition to hurt me later. 3 years earlier, I'd landed a contract with a mid-sized marketing firm in Seattle, my biggest client at the time, and I'd been so proud, so excited that I'd mentioned it at Christmas dinner. And Emily had laughed and said something about how cute it was that I was still playing around with my little art projects, and my mother had asked if it paid enough to actually matter. And I'd felt my excitement curdle into shame and realized that sharing my successes with them was like handing them weapons they'd inevitably use against me. So this time, when I'd started developing what I was calling the adaptive design system, a comprehensive framework for responsive brand identity that could scale across platforms while maintaining coherence, I'd kept it entirely to myself, working from 9 at night until 2 in the morning after David was asleep, teaching myself new coding languages and design software, building something I believed was genuinely innovative, but not letting myself hope too much, because hope had always led to disappointment where my family was concerned. The work was meticulous and demanding, required a level of technical skill I'd spent years developing through online courses I'd paid for myself, through trial and error, through the kind of dedication that nobody saw, because it happened in the quiet hours when David was dreaming and the apartment was dark except for the blue glow of my monitor. I'd been building component libraries and documentation, creating case studies, developing the theoretical framework that explained why this system solved problems that traditional brand guidelines couldn't address in an increasingly fragmented digital landscape. And some nights I'd lean back from my desk at 1 in the morning and think that maybe, possibly, I'd created something valuable, something that proved my work wasn't a hobby or a cute little art project, but a legitimate professional contribution. My friend Maya, who worked as a UX director at a tech company in Portland, was the only person who knew what I was doing, and she'd been encouraging me for months to put together a portfolio, to start showing it to people who might understand its value. But I'd been hesitant because putting it out there meant risking rejection, meant potentially confirming what my family had always implied about my work. The system incorporated responsive typography, flexible color frameworks, modular component architecture, and what I considered my most innovative contribution, an adaptive logo system that maintained brand recognition while optimizing for different contexts and platforms. And I'd tested it across dozens of scenarios, refined it through hundreds of hours of iteration, built something I knew in my bones was good, even if I was terrified to claim that publicly. My birthday that year fell on a Tuesday in March, and I woke up thinking maybe this time would be different, that maybe someone would remember without me having to remind them. But by 8 that evening, when I was putting David to bed, I understood with the familiar ache of accumulated disappointments that it was just another day as far as my family was concerned. No phone calls or texts or cards, nothing to acknowledge that I'd turned 32 and spent the day working on client projects while David was at school, and then made boxed macaroni for dinner because I was too tired to cook anything more elaborate. Emily's birthday had been 6 weeks earlier, a Saturday in late January, and my parents had hosted a catered brunch at their house with mimosas and a custom cake from the expensive bakery downtown, posted dozens of photos on Facebook celebrating their amazing daughter, while Emily opened gifts that included jewelry and spa packages and a weekend trip to wine country, and I'd attended with David and given her a thoughtful present I'd spent 2 weeks choosing, a first edition book by her favorite author that I'd found through an online rare book dealer, and she'd barely glanced at it before setting it aside to open the next gift. The pattern extended beyond birthdays into every aspect of family life, visible in the way David was systematically excluded from cousin activities, not invited to Sophie's sleepover birthday party or James's trip to the trampoline park, always with some excuse from Emily about limited space or specific age groups, when the real message was clear enough that even David had started to notice and ask fewer questions about why he couldn't come. I'd designed the entire website for Emily's husband's real estate company 2 years ago, spent 40 hours building something professional and functional with custom graphics and an integrated property search feature, charged them nothing because Emily said it was family helping family, and then never received even a basic thank you. Just complaints about minor details and requests for constant free updates whenever they wanted something changed. My parents called me regularly for help with their computer problems, with setting up their new phones, with explaining their medical bills and dealing with their insurance company, with running errands when they needed something picked up because I had a flexible schedule that they assumed meant I had infinite free time. And I did these things because they were my parents, and some part of me kept hoping that being useful would translate into being valued. But the calls only came when they needed something, and never to ask how I was managing, or whether David needed anything, or if my work was going well. The accumulated weight of being invisible except when needed had pressed down on me for so many years that I'd almost stopped noticing it, had almost accepted that this was simply how things were and how they would always be, that my role in this family was to be the disappointing daughter who provided free labor and asked for nothing in return, and certainly never expected the kind of celebration or acknowledgement that Emily received simply for existing. The text came through on a Thursday afternoon in late April, a group message to the family chat that I almost didn't open because family communications had become something I approached with preemptive exhaustion, but I saw it was from Emily and felt that familiar obligation to read it, to stay informed, to remain connected even when connection meant subjecting myself to reminders of my peripheral status in this family. Sophie's engagement party, May 18th at Riverside Country Club. Cocktail attire, dinner and dancing. Can't wait to celebrate our beautiful girl. Followed by a string of champagne and heart emojis. And I felt genuinely happy for my niece Sophie, who had always been kind to David and me, even when her mother wasn't, who had recently gotten engaged to a man she'd been dating for 3 years and seemed genuinely in love. And I was already mentally calculating whether I could afford a nice gift when the next message came through, this one directed at me specifically. Rachel, don't worry about bringing a gift. We know money is tight for you right now, and your presence is enough. The words landed like they always did, wrapped in the language of consideration, but delivering the message that I was poor, struggling, someone to be pitied rather than treated as an equal, and I sat there staring at my phone screen in the pickup line at David's school, feeling that familiar burn of humiliation, mixed with anger that I never quite knew what to do with. Because how do you argue with someone who's pretending to be thoughtful while actually being condescending? I typed and deleted 3 different responses, each one trying to find the balance between defending myself and not creating drama, before finally just sending back a thumbs up emoji. Because what else could I say? And I sat there gripping my phone thinking about how Emily's assumption that I couldn't afford a gift was based on years of her deciding what my life looked like without ever actually asking about it. About how she'd constructed this narrative where I was perpetually struggling and she was perpetually thriving, and nothing I did seemed to penetrate that story she'd built. The engagement party was 3 weeks away at a country club I'd never been to, because country clubs weren't part of my world according to the family mythology, and I went back and forth dozens of times over the next few days about whether to even attend because these gatherings always left me feeling hollow and diminished. But Sophie had texted me separately asking me to please come and saying she'd love to see David, and I couldn't say no to her even though I wanted desperately to avoid another evening of feeling invisible. 2 days after the initial announcement, David asked me a question while I was making dinner, his voice careful in that way children's voices get when they're asking about something that's been bothering them for a while, and he said, "Mom, why doesn't Grandma like us very much?" And I felt my heart crack open because I'd been trying so hard to shield him from noticing the pattern I'd lived with my entire life. But 8 years old was old enough to see who got attention and affection, and who got forgotten, who got included, and who got bread baskets while everyone else ate steaks. I knelt down next to him, trying to find words that were honest, but wouldn't hurt him more than he was already hurting. And I said something about how sometimes families are complicated, and it doesn't mean anything about his worth or who he is. But even as I said it, I could hear how inadequate the explanation was, how it didn't address the real question he was asking, which was why love seemed to be distributed so unequally in a family that was supposed to care about all its members. The email came through on a Monday morning, exactly 1 week before Sophie's engagement party, and I almost missed it because I was reviewing a client's feedback on a logo redesign while simultaneously making David's lunch for school. The familiar chaos of trying to work while parenting, meaning that I often triaged my inbox and dealt with anything that wasn't immediately urgent later in the day. But something about the subject line caught my eye. Design System Acquisition Proposal, Cascade Technologies. And I felt my stomach drop, because Cascade Technologies wasn't some small startup, but a major tech company whose products I used regularly, whose name carried weight in the industry, and I couldn't imagine why they'd be emailing me directly. I opened it standing in my kitchen with peanut butter still on my fingers, and I had to read the first paragraph 3 times before the words started to penetrate the shock that was making everything feel surreal and distant. Maya Chen, a colleague I'd worked with on 2 freelance projects over the past year and who had become something close to a real friend, had submitted my design system portfolio to Cascade's creative director without telling me, and they wanted to acquire the comprehensive UI component library I'd been building and refining for the past 18 months during all those late nights after David went to sleep. The offer was outlined in bullet points that I kept reading over and over. $240,000 annual salary for the position of senior creative director, plus $180,000 for the existing design system and all associated documentation and templates, with benefits including full health insurance and a retirement match, and stock options that the email explained in detail I couldn't fully absorb in that moment. I sat down at my kitchen table because my legs felt unreliable, and I just stared at the numbers, at the formal language describing my work as innovative and industry-leading, and exactly the scalable solution we've been seeking. And some part of my brain kept insisting this had to be a mistake or a scam, or something other than what it appeared to be, because things like this didn't happen to people like me. To single mothers working from home in modest apartments who got handed bread baskets while their family ate expensive meals. My phone rang 10 minutes later, and it was Maya, her voice bright with excitement, asking if I'd seen the email yet. And I managed to say yes, and she launched into an explanation about how she'd been talking to Cascade's creative director at an industry meetup and mentioned my work and shown him some examples, and he'd asked her to make an introduction, and she was saying, "Rachel, you deserve this. Your work is exceptional, and you need to stop hiding it." But I was still trying to process the reality that someone had seen value in what I'd created, actual monetary value that exceeded anything I'd imagined. The internal struggle started immediately, the ingrained instinct to keep this quiet, because 3 years ago, I'd told my family about landing a recurring contract with a mid-sized marketing firm that doubled my monthly income, and Emily had laughed at Christmas dinner and said something about me acting like I'd won the lottery when it was just some website stuff. And I'd learned then that sharing my successes only invited dismissal or mockery or somehow made me feel smaller than if I'd said nothing at all. But sitting there looking at that email with Maya on the phone, telling me I needed to respond and schedule a formal meeting to discuss terms, I felt something shifting inside me. Some recognition that maybe the problem wasn't my success, but my family's inability to acknowledge it. And maybe I was tired of making myself smaller to fit into their narrative about who I was supposed to be. The decision crystallized over the course of 3 days, during which I went back and forth between telling my family about the Cascade offer before the engagement party, or waiting until after, or just staying silent altogether. But something shifted inside me on Wednesday when I was helping David with his homework, and he asked me why I didn't talk about my work the way Uncle Mark talked about his accounting firm. And I realized I'd been teaching my son to hide his light the same way I'd learned to hide mine. I would attend Sophie's engagement party, and I would tell them, not because I needed their validation or approval, but because I was done shrinking myself to fit into their narrow perception of who I was allowed to be. The preparation for that evening became something more than just getting ready for a party. It became a quiet reclamation of my right to take up space and be seen. I went to Nordstrom on Thursday afternoon while David was at school, and I bought a dress that cost $370, which was more than I'd spent on myself for clothing in the past year combined. A deep emerald silk that fit perfectly, and made me look elegant and successful, and nothing like the struggling single mother my family had decided I was. I got my hair done professionally on Friday at a salon I'd walked past 100 times but never entered, and the stylist shaped and highlighted it in a way that made me look polished and intentional. And when I looked at myself in the mirror, I barely recognized the confident woman looking back. I bought David a new suit, charcoal gray with a crisp white shirt, and when he tried it on, he stood up straighter and asked if he looked grown up, and I told him he looked handsome and perfect. He noticed something had changed in me over those few days of preparation, asking me on Saturday morning why I seemed so happy. And I told him that sometimes it takes a while to remember who you really are underneath what other people think about you, and he nodded like he understood, even though 8 years old was probably too young to fully grasp what I meant. I realized as I was getting ready on the evening of the party, applying makeup with steady hands while David watched cartoons in the living room, that I'd been hiding my achievements and my capabilities, not just to avoid my family's mockery, but because some part of me had internalized their view of me as less than, as someone who didn't deserve success or recognition or beautiful things. The drive to Riverside Country Club took 25 minutes through early evening traffic, and I used that time to center myself and remember that whatever happened that night, I was walking in as someone who had built something valuable and real, someone who had earned her success through talent and hard work and dedication, and no amount of dismissal or condescension could change that truth. David was quiet in the passenger seat, looking out the window, and I reached over and squeezed his hand and said, "We belong anywhere we choose to be." And I meant it. Riverside Country Club was exactly the kind of place my family loved. All pristine gardens and valet parking, and a massive stone facade that announced wealth and status before you even walked through the doors. And when David and I pulled up in my 7-year-old Honda Civic, I saw Emily's new Lexus already parked in a prominent spot near the entrance. The valet who took my keys was professionally polite, but I caught the slight flicker of assessment in his eyes as he looked at my car compared to the Mercedes and BMWs surrounding it. And I straightened my shoulders and took David's hand and walked into the club like I had every right to be there because I did. The party was being held in the Magnolia Ballroom, which I could hear before I saw it. The sound of laughter and conversation spilling out into the marble-floored hallway. And when we walked through the entrance, I saw my family had essentially taken over the entire space. Maybe 60 people spread throughout the elegant room with its crystal chandeliers and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the golf course. Emily saw me first, and I watched her eyes widen and then narrow as she took in my emerald dress and professional hair and the overall impression I knew I was making, which was so far from her mental image of struggling, desperate Rachel that she couldn't quite process it. She crossed the room toward me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes and said, "Rachel, wow, you look different." And there was a question buried in that statement, an implicit demand to know how I'd managed this transformation. "How did you afford that dress?" she asked, before I could respond to her first comment, and her voice was just loud enough that several nearby relatives turned to look, and I saw my mother's head swivel in our direction from across the room. I smiled and said, "I've been doing well lately," keeping my voice pleasant and nonspecific, and Emily's expression went through several rapid shifts before landing on something that looked like competitive concern. "Well, you shouldn't have spent money you don't have just for a party," she said, reaching out to touch the silk of my sleeve. "I would have loaned you something if you'd asked." I was saved from responding by my mother appearing at my elbow, her face arranged in the expression I knew so well, that mixture of disappointment and judgment she reserved specifically for me, and she pulled me aside with a firm grip on my arm while Emily moved away to greet other guests. "Rachel, sweetheart, did you borrow money for that outfit?" my mother asked in a low, urgent whisper, and the implication was clear, the assumption that I must have done something irresponsible or desperate to look this put together. I met her eyes and said, "No, Mom, I didn't borrow anything." And I saw her confusion deepen because she couldn't reconcile this version of me with the narrative she'd constructed. Before she could ask more questions, Sophie appeared. my niece who was the reason for this whole gathering, and her face lit up when she saw me. "Aunt Rachel, you look amazing," she said, and she hugged me with genuine warmth, then knelt down to David's level and told him he looked very handsome in his new suit, and I felt something in my chest loosen, because Sophie had always been kind, had never absorbed her mother's dismissiveness or her grandparents' favoritism, and I realized that whatever toxicity existed in my family, it wasn't universal and it wasn't inevitable. The gift presentation began around 7:30, after everyone had been served champagne and hors d'oeuvres and had mingled sufficiently for Emily to feel she had an appropriately large and attentive audience. Sophie and her fiancé were seated at a table near the front of the room with their backs to the floor-to-ceiling windows, and Emily stood beside them arranging the growing pile of elegantly wrapped boxes and envelopes with the practiced efficiency of someone who had orchestrated many such performances. My father went first, presenting a cream-colored envelope with both hands and a formal little speech about how proud they were of Sophie and how they knew she and Trevor would build a wonderful life together. And when Sophie opened it and saw the check for $15,000, she gasped and covered her mouth and thanked them with tears in her eyes while everyone applauded. Emily's sister-in-law presented a crystal vase from Tiffany, and Emily's college roommate gave a spa weekend package, and my Aunt Sharon contributed a set of monogrammed luggage, and with each gift Emily made sure to announce what it was and who it was from, narrating the generosity for the entire room like she was hosting a particularly wholesome game show. I stood near the back with David beside me, my small clutch purse held in both hands, the envelope inside it feeling both weightless and incredibly heavy. And I watched my family perform their affluence and their affection with the ease of people who had never questioned their place in the world. Emily's gift to her own daughter was presented last before she opened it up to the extended family, and it was a week in Tuscany for the honeymoon, all expenses paid, which she announced with a flourish that drew the longest applause yet. And I saw Sophie hug her mother with genuine gratitude, while Emily beamed with the satisfaction of someone who had once again proven herself the most generous person in the room. Then Emily turned and scanned the crowd, and her eyes landed on me, and I saw the calculation happen in real time as she decided to acknowledge me publicly in a way that would reinforce the family narrative. "Oh, Rachel," she called out, her voice projecting across the ballroom with practiced clarity. "You didn't have to bring anything, really. We know how things are for you." She smiled that patronizing smile I had seen 1,000 times, the one that said she was being charitable by not expecting anything from me, the one that positioned her as magnanimous and me as pitiable. The room went quiet in that way rooms do when everyone senses something significant is happening, when social antennae pick up on tension or drama or unexpected development, and I felt every pair of eyes turn toward me and David standing at the back of the Magnolia Ballroom. I met Emily's gaze across the distance and felt something settle into place inside me, a calm certainty that this moment had been building for years and had finally arrived. I reached into my clutch and pulled out the envelope I had prepared, cream-colored like my father's, my handwriting on the front spelling out Sophie's full name. "Actually," I said, my voice steady and clear as I began walking toward the front of the room with David following close behind me. "I did bring something." The room seemed to hold its breath as I approached, and I saw confusion flicker across Emily's face because this was not following the script she had written. I reached Sophie and handed her the envelope directly, and she looked uncertain as she took it, glancing at her mother whose expression had gone carefully neutral in that way people's faces do when they're trying to hide alarm. Sophie opened the envelope with delicate fingers and pulled out the check, and I watched her eyes scan the amount, and then go wide with genuine shock, and she said, "Aunt Rachel, this is $10,000, in a voice that carried across the suddenly silent ballroom. The gasp was collective, a sharp intake of breath from 60 people simultaneously, and I saw my mother's hand fly to her chest while my father's mouth literally dropped open, and Emily's face didn't freeze so much as shatter, her careful social mask cracking into a dozen pieces of confusion and something that looked uncomfortably like panic. "Where did you get that money?" my mother asked, her voice cutting through the silence with an edge I recognized. That tone she used when she suspected I'd done something shameful or irresponsible, and the implication hung in the air between us that there must be something wrong with how I'd acquired it. I turned to face her and the rest of my assembled family and said in a voice that was calm and clear and completely steady, "I earned it, from my work, which is actually very successful." And I saw my mother's confusion deepen because this answer didn't fit any narrative she had constructed about my life. Emily let out a laugh that sounded nervous and slightly desperate and said, "Your little design hobby?" with an attempt at her usual dismissiveness. But her voice wavered on the word hobby, and I could see in her eyes that she was scrambling to reassert the family hierarchy that had just been disrupted. I looked at my sister, this woman who had spent years positioning herself above me, and felt no anger, only a kind of clear-eyed certainty about what I was about to do. "Not a hobby," I said, my voice carrying to every corner of the Magnolia Ballroom, and I was aware of David beside me, and Sophie still holding my check, and every single family member watching this moment unfold. "I've been working for the past 6 months on a comprehensive design system for user interface applications," I continued, and I watched incomprehension spread across most of their faces because they had never asked about my actual work, had never wanted to know the specifics of what I did during all those hours they dismissed as playing on the computer. "A colleague submitted my portfolio to TechCore Solutions without telling me," I said, and now I had their complete attention in a way I had never experienced before. Every eye fixed on me, every ear straining to hear. 3 weeks ago, they made me an offer to acquire my design system and hire me as their creative director. And I paused because I wanted them to understand what was coming next, wanted them to really hear it. The offer was $180,000 for my existing work, plus a salary of $240,000 annually. The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear the sound of the air conditioning, could hear someone's champagne glass being set down on a table, could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, and I watched my family process information that contradicted everything they thought they knew about me. My father was the first to recover, and I watched him try to recalibrate his entire understanding of my life in real time, his face cycling through shock and confusion, and finally landing on a kind of forced pride that looked painful to produce. $420,000 total, he said, his voice loud enough that everyone could hear him doing the math, and I nodded once, a simple confirmation that seemed to hit him physically. My mother's hand was still pressed to her chest, and she was shaking her head slightly as if she could deny what she'd just heard, and I saw her mouth opening and closing without sound, searching for words that would make this information fit into the world as she understood it. Emily had gone very still beside Sophie, her face pale, except for 2 spots of red high on her cheeks, and I recognized that look from childhood. That expression she got when something happened that she hadn't orchestrated and couldn't control. "I don't understand," my mother finally said, and her voice had lost all its earlier certainty, all its judgment. "You never said anything about this." I looked at her and felt a decade of silence between us, all the times I had tried to share something and been dismissed. All the accomplishments I had learned to keep quiet because enthusiasm was treated as bragging and pride was treated as delusion. "I learned not to," I said simply, and I saw her flinch. Sophie was still holding my check, and she said, "Aunt Rachel, this is incredibly generous. I don't know what to say." And her voice was genuinely warm, genuinely grateful, and I realized that my niece had never been part of the cruelty, had never treated David as less than, had inherited none of her mother's need to establish hierarchy. "You don't have to say anything," I told her. "I'm happy for you and Trevor. I hope you'll use it for something that brings you joy." It was then that Maya stepped forward from where she had been standing near the windows, and I felt a rush of gratitude for her presence, for the fact that I hadn't had to face this moment entirely alone. "If I can add something," Maya said, and her voice had the calm authority of someone used to presenting in boardrooms, "Rachel is being characteristically modest about her work. Her design system is already being used by 6 Fortune 500 companies under white label agreements. She's considered one of the top UI designers in the tech industry. TechCore has been trying to recruit her for 2 years, and they specifically created the creative director position for her because they knew she wouldn't accept anything less than a leadership role. I felt my face flush because I hadn't known some of these details, hadn't known that Maya had been fielding recruitment attempts on my behalf, protecting me from distraction while I worked. My father said 6 Fortune 500 companies in a voice that suggested he was reassessing everything he thought he knew, and Maya nodded. Her work is extraordinary. Those of us who actually pay attention have known that for years. The words, those of us who actually pay attention, landed like a stone in still water, and I saw my mother's face crumple slightly, saw my father look down at his hands, saw Emily's careful composure finally crack. The room was completely silent except for the sound of my mother's uncertain breathing, and I realized that for the first time in my adult life, I had the attention of my entire family without having to beg for it, or perform for it, or shrink myself to deserve it. I looked at Emily and saw tears forming in her eyes, and I felt no satisfaction in her distress. Only a kind of sadness, for all the years we could have been actual sisters, instead of competitors in a hierarchy neither of us had chosen. I need to say something, I said, and my voice was calm and clear and completely steady, in a way it had never been when addressing my family. Every time you called my work a hobby, I was supporting my son. Every time you forgot my birthday, while throwing elaborate parties for Emily, I was building something real. Every time you made David feel less than his cousins, every time you handed him a breadbasket while your grandchildren ordered $100 meals, you showed me exactly who you are. I wasn't shouting and I wasn't crying and I wasn't asking for anything, just stating facts that had lived in my chest for years. My father's face had gone red, and he opened his mouth and said, "Rachel, we're proud of you. We've always been proud." And I looked at him and shook my head slowly. "No," I said, just that one word, and I saw him flinch. "You weren't proud when I got my first major client 3 years ago." And Emily laughed about my little computer drawings at Christmas dinner. "You weren't proud when I was working 3 jobs to keep David in daycare. You weren't proud last month when I couldn't afford to contribute to the family vacation fund, and Mom said maybe I should find more stable work." My mother made a small sound and said, "I always believed in you. I just worried about your stability." And I recognized this revision of history, this attempt to rewrite years of dismissal as concern. "You didn't worry about my stability," I said quietly. "You were embarrassed by my choices." "There's a difference." I turned to Emily and saw her wiping at her eyes with careful fingers, trying not to smudge her makeup, and I felt something in my chest that might have been compassion, or might have been just exhaustion with the whole dynamic. "You've spent years making sure everyone knew you were the successful sister," I told her. "You've made sure David knew he was less important than your children. You've made sure I knew my work didn't matter, that I didn't measure up, that I was the family disappointment." My voice didn't rise, but the words hung in the air between us, undeniable. Emily opened her mouth and closed it again, and finally whispered, "I'm sorry." And I didn't know if she meant it, or if she was just responding to the shock of the moment, to the sudden inversion of everything she'd believed about our relative worth. Sophie moved closer to me and put her hand on my arm and said, "Aunt Rachel, I never knew they treated you like that." And I looked at my niece and saw genuine distress in her face, and I realized that the next generation didn't have to inherit this toxicity. "I didn't know because no one told you," I said to Sophie, and I kept my voice gentle because she was young and kind and deserved honesty without harshness. "I'm telling you now because I want things to be different going forward." My Uncle Robert stepped forward from where he'd been standing with his wife near the dessert table and he said, "Rachel, I had no idea about your success, congratulations." And his voice sounded genuine, and I remembered that he had always been one of the kinder relatives, always asked about David when others didn't. "Thank you," I said, and I felt Maya's presence beside me like an anchor, reminding me that I had people who saw my worth, even when my family hadn't. My mother was crying now, mascara tracking down her cheeks, and she said, "I'm so sorry, Rachel. I never meant to make you feel less than." And I looked at her and felt the complicated tangle of love and hurt that comes from wanting a parent's approval for so long and finally realizing you'll survive without it. "I know you didn't mean to," I said, which was true and also insufficient, because intention doesn't erase impact. My father cleared his throat and said, "We should celebrate this, your success, maybe have a dinner in your honor." And I recognized this impulse to smooth things over, to restore equilibrium without actually addressing what had broken it, and I shook my head. "What I need isn't celebration," I said clearly. "What I need is for David and me to be treated with the same respect you show Emily's family. What I need is for my son to never again be handed a breadbasket while his cousins order whatever they want. What I need is for my work to be acknowledged as real and valuable, not dismissed as a hobby." I paused and looked around the room at faces that were familiar and also strange. Family members I had loved and resented and needed and outgrown all at once. "I'm not cutting anyone off," I continued, and I saw relief flash across several faces. "But I'm also not going to keep accepting less than I deserve. If you can respect that, then we'll rebuild our relationships. If you can't, then we'll have distance." Emily finally spoke, and her voice was thick with tears, and she said, "I never realized I was being cruel, Rachel. I swear I didn't." And I believed her because cruelty that comes from thoughtlessness, rather than malice, is still cruelty, but it's a different kind, maybe one that can be addressed. "I believe you," I told her. "But David knew. He's 8 years old, and he knew that you treated him differently than your kids. He asked me why Grandma doesn't like us." I saw my mother's face crumple completely at this, and she pressed her hand to her mouth, and my father looked stricken, and I felt no triumph in their pain, but I also felt no obligation to minimize the truth to spare their feelings. Sophie moved closer and hugged me tightly and whispered, "Thank you for the gift, and thank you for being honest." And I hugged her back and thought about how she was getting married and starting her own family, and maybe she would do things differently. Maybe the patterns could break with her generation. David had been sitting at a table near the windows with Maya's husband Tom, and I saw him watching me with wide eyes, and I realized that he was seeing his mother in a completely new way, seeing me stand up for both of us, seeing me refuse to shrink. I walked over to him and knelt down beside his chair and said, "You okay, buddy?" And he nodded and then said, "You were really brave, Mom." And I felt my eyes fill with tears because that was what I wanted him to learn, that standing up for yourself was brave and necessary and possible. 2 months later, I was sitting across from David at a restaurant I'd chosen specifically because it was bright and welcoming, and the kind of place where an 8-year-old could feel comfortable. And when the waiter came to take our order, I told David he could have anything he wanted from the menu and watched his eyes light up as he ordered the pasta dish with the garlic bread and the chocolate milkshake he'd been eyeing since we sat down. The waiter smiled at him and said, "Excellent choice." And I felt something settle in my chest that had been restless for years. The knowledge that I was breaking a cycle, that my son would never associate family meals with deprivation or shame or feeling less than. We'd moved into a new apartment 3 weeks earlier, a 2-bedroom with actual space and natural light, and a building that had a small playground where David had already made friends. And every morning when I woke up in a place that felt like ours, truly ours, and not just somewhere we were surviving, I felt the weight of the old life lifting incrementally. My position at the tech company was everything Maya had promised it would be, and also more challenging than I'd expected. But it was the kind of challenge that made me grow, rather than the kind that made me shrink, and my team respected my vision, and my colleagues treated my ideas as valuable, and I was learning that professional respect felt entirely different from family obligation. My father had called me twice since the engagement party, actual phone calls where he asked about my work and about David and said he was sorry for not seeing what I'd been building all these years. And I could hear in his voice that he was trying, genuinely trying, and I was letting him try without making it easy, because easy hadn't served me well in the past. Sophie texted me regularly with updates about her wedding planning, and photos of dresses she was considering, and questions about my opinion that seemed to value my input as real rather than perfunctory. And I was learning what it felt like to have family relationships that didn't require me to diminish myself to maintain them. Emily and I had spoken once, a stilted conversation where she'd apologized again and I'd accepted her apology while also not pretending that years of cruelty could be erased by acknowledgement. And we'd agreed to take things slowly, to rebuild if we could, but to accept distance if we couldn't. And I had peace with either outcome in a way that surprised me. My mother remained awkward and uncertain, sending occasional texts that tried too hard to be supportive, and I responded politely, but without the desperate need for her approval that had defined so much of my adult life, and that freedom felt like breathing after being underwater. Maya had become the kind of friend who felt like chosen family, the person I called when David did something funny, or when work was overwhelming, or when I just needed to hear a voice that had always believed in me. And I was learning that the family you choose can be just as important as the family you're born into, and sometimes more so. David's new school was better resourced and more diverse, and he'd made a best friend named Marcus, who came over for play dates where I served snacks without calculating the cost, and watching my son thrive in an environment where he felt secure and valued was worth every late night I'd worked, and every moment of doubt I'd pushed through. I looked at him across the table as he told me about the science project he wanted to do, and the book he was reading, and the game he and Marcus had invented at recess. And I realized that he was growing up watching his mother stand up for herself and set boundaries and claim her worth. And that was a better inheritance than money or status or family approval. The waiter brought our food, and David's face lit up at the size of the milkshake, and I thought about that family dinner months ago when Emily had handed him a bread basket while her children ordered freely, and I felt no bitterness anymore, just a clear-eyed understanding of what had been and a commitment to what would be different going forward. I had learned that forgiveness didn't require pretending harm hadn't happened, and that boundaries weren't punishment, but protection, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself and your child is to stop accepting less than you deserve. We ate our dinner in the warm light of the restaurant, and David told me about his day, and I told him about mine, and we were just a mother and son sharing a meal, but it felt like victory, quiet and hard-won, and infinitely precious.